15, I got right hot off the presses the Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra, and I really loved that book because it was pointing to this ignored factor in science called consciousness that I after reading the book, it really turned me on to that. This is what has been the focus of a lot of these religious and spiritual traditions, the very mystery of how we can be aware at all and the nature of existence. So I started, for the very first time, started reading some scriptures a little bit and finding, with the mind of a scientist, finding this very fascinating, that they're actually exploring this ignored factor in science called consciousness. And so I decided that's what I want to study at the university. I want to study consciousness and try to integrate science with consciousness. So I decided to go to UC Berkeley, which is where Fritjof Capra was teaching, and turned down a number of other opportunities to go to other universities. And I went to Berkeley with that explicit interest to really help bring about a physics of consciousness. And my very first couple days at Berkeley, long before classes started, brought about a permanent change in my life and reality, because I had just 2 or 3 days after I arrived at the dorms, the students weren't even all arrived, I had a spontaneous Kundalini experience that was an extremely powerful, transformative experience that took me very rapidly, within a matter of a few hours, from the sense of myself as just a student has just arrived at Berkeley sitting on my bed reading a book, to experiencing an illumination that just flooded through me to the point that I was literally dissolved in this incandescent radiance, such that myself and the universe were completely, had literally dissolved in boundless luminosity. And it was a truly ecstatic experience, and I'm very, very, perplexed and grateful that I had that experience. I know lots of people have had Kundalini experiences and they've been difficult. They've struggled with it, or they've had resistance to it. Somehow I was in just the perfect open state to just allow that energy just to sweep through me and totally dissolve me. And it was a disillusion experience that has permanently stayed with me. It's helped me understand at sort of a fundamental level this blessed knowledge that I don't really exist in the way that I appear to, and that there's a much larger field of existence and field of being that is fundamentally the case prior to any conditional arising whatsoever. And so I have that sort of deep sensibility, and it's something that it's a felt experience. I mean, I can have the feeling that I'm very aware that I'm here talking to you in this body. I feel like I'm pretty much in my body talking to you, but at the same time I'm very aware that there's just this formless, boundless, edgeless being, which is just infinite potential, which is actually manifesting as the universe continuously in this mysterious process, and that I'm also, and more priorly and fundamentally, that. And it's the profound frame of reference change that gave me has made me very dedicated to helping transmit this understanding and encourage others to find it, because there are very profound things that come with having such a shift of identity. One of the most profound things is that when you fundamentally know yourself to be boundless, indestructible being beyond space and time, you can truly transcend all fear. And fear is something that only can arise within a sense of separate self, or within a sense of separateness. So without a fundamental sense that you're a separate, threatened, isolated organism in a big kind of dangerous universe, without that sense of prior unconditional existence, it's impossible to get the fear out of your system. And our organisms are coded to, have fear as a natural response for survival. But when the ego gets very contracted and there's a lot of stress that builds up in the body, that sense of fear can totally dominate the organism, dominate the psychology of the organism, and we have a whole planet of profoundly fear-ridden humans. And fear is the flip side of violence. Fear and violence are actually one and the same thing. When you actually interview somebody who did a violent act, and you really get down to what drove them, they said, well, I was just afraid. And that's the ultimate excuse for violence. It really comes down to fear. So fear and violence-ridden, or fear-ridden, violence-prone humans is what we get when people are lacking that fundamental experience of prior unitive being that's not threatened. And so I had this experience, and when I came out of the experience, my first thought, because I had literally experienced the entire universe dissolving into light, and me, and everything, and I realized there is this prior, all-pervading, radiant, conscious being that simply is, and that it's mysteriously manifesting as all that exists in the conditional world. And when I recondensed sufficiently into a body to suddenly have a frame of reference of, I was actually walking along a street when this happened, to see the street and the cars and everything around me, my very first thought was, how do I know this is the same universe? Because experientially, the whole universe and me and everything had dissolved into just unconditional white light. And so I thought, well, maybe this one it's a facsimile that looks the same, but it might have real differences. And it led me into a whole series of intense questionings about, could this be a parallel universe? Could I? And I after the experience, my whole perception was fundamentally changed, and so I was seeing the world differently, and I wasn't sure whether I was just seeing it differently or it's really a different universe. And it made me think, well, maybe people are popping in and out of parallel universes all the time and just aren't paying enough attention to notice. And if there's discrepancies, they just write it off as like, oh, I just must have been mistaken. And so I eventually evolved a multiverse model to explain my experience, because shortly after this experience, a whole host of paranormal phenomena started just happening to me. I mean, dramatic stuff, including physical objects that were in my possession vanishing and being found 800 miles away the same day. And people calling me from 800 miles away and saying, oh, you must have left this when you were here last week. And I knew I had it that morning. And also profound telepathy, psychokinesis, all these things. And here I am, just about to start studying physics, wanting to study the connection between physics and consciousness. And this whole raft of paranormal phenomena is happening to me before I even start classes. And so it really got what I asked for. I got a living laboratory in which to study the connection between physics and consciousness. And the connection, to me, became very clear that there's something very profound going on relative to how our belief systems affect how reality happens to us. Now, we all know that. We know that our belief systems are very, very powerful. We know that they cause us to interpret reality different, such that we literally see reality different. And belief systems function as these filters, such that whatever you assume, whatever assumptions you operate out of, you tend to see a reality that supports those assumptions. And any belief system works that way. But what became very clear to me, and that this was very challenging for me to get across to people, was that it not only affects your passive interpretation of reality, but that my change of belief systems was actually affecting the way the laws of physics were happening to me. That this sacred, sense within this priesthood of science, that the laws of physics are just inscribed upon this material world, this sort of objective world out there, and they're immutable, and they're written in stone, and they don't change, and that we're just sort of passive witnesses of them. That dissolved very rapidly. This is long before I had really done any more advanced study of the observer phenomenon in quantum physics or anything. I just realized that, I suddenly changed my belief that the universe, I no longer believed the universe was a mechanical, causal, machine-like phenomena. I was experiencing it much more like a shimmering apparition arising in a field of consciousness much more like a dream than like a machine. And as soon as I made that shift, suddenly the universe actually started manifesting to me like a dream. Things that could only happen in dreams were happening to me, and I was literally experiencing it. And it was such a profound insight to realize that, oh my God, the laws of physics, which are studying regularities in nature, we've been mapping out these things that always happen, these certain regular features in the whole dynamic of matter and energy, space and time. These regularities may in fact be regularities in how we pay attention to the world, and not so much, thank you, not so much regularities in some supposed objective world out there. Because what had happened is I had had a profound shift in the way I was attending to reality. And so I started to see that we've all been programmed to pay attention to our outer experience in a specific way, and it's a deeply subconscious program, such that we don't even know we're following a certain protocol in how we attend to the world, and that the regularities that are then formalized as the laws of physics are actually regularities in how we attend to the world. And if you can break out of those patterns, suddenly you find yourself living in a much more dynamic and magical universe, and that the limits of the laws of physics do not hold anymore. And that I was having a very challenging time getting this across to a lot of my other students who were around me, and a lot of physicists. I was starting freshman physics. Fortunately, one of my physics classes had Fritjof-Capra in it, but this was even too much for him. I was talking to him about this, and he found it to be really, really a stretch. And he was still holding with the dogma of, the laws of physics are the laws of physics, and mystical experience might cause us to, filter and experience them differently. But I was trying to say, no, actually, the way matter and energy happen, the whole fundamental dynamics, can be changed with a change of consciousness, and that was a stretch to him. And so I was like, whoa, I'm really out in no man's land here, exploring this. And so I started talking to a lot of physicists, telling them my experiences. I would just, I was very innocent and naive, and I just would go up to physicists who were at the university. I'd just go to their offices, and I'd sit down and I'd say, I've just had an experience in which, a physical object that I had in my room, in my dorm room, I came back, I was gone for half an hour, and I came back and it was gone, and it was found 800 miles away the same afternoon. How can we explain this? And they'd say, clearly that didn't happen. They would say, that violates the laws of physics. And I was saying, I know, but could that possibly imply that the laws of physics aren't complete, that they might need some updating, that there might be some unusual conditions in which these sort of things could happen? And I was, eventually became known as somebody who would torment them with these sort of things because I was constantly asking these questions. In fact, I even, a little while after that, I went back down to Southern California, and I would periodically go down there, and I had known Richard Feynman when I was a high school student. In fact, my physics classes in high school were sufficiently boring, even though I loved physics, that I went over to Caltech, talked to Feynman, and said, could you come to my physics class? And he came, and we became good friends. And so I went back to him and started telling him all these things. And he found it really, he was very kind, and he found it very interesting, but he also, just said, you need to go see a priest. He says, that's not my job. I can't deal with things like that. I'm just a guy who solves tricky little problems. And so I eventually went back to Berkeley and had this very interesting experience in which I spoke to a physicist who I was asking for some real help in sort of evolving an alternative model. And I was doing this all in my freshman year while I was enduring all the boring other classes that were just sort of going at such a slow rate. So my main focus was reformulating all the laws of physics, mathematics, chemistry, and philosophy to encompass what I'd experienced. And I went to this guy and he kept saying, you didn't have those experiences. He says, you were hallucinating. And I said, well, even if I was hallucinating, it was my experience. That is what I experienced. And he says, well, we can't accept that in science. And I said, well, how can we build our notion of the universe without relying on our experience? And he says, well, there's certain protocols in science you have to follow. You can't just accept your experience. And I said, I was going back and forth with him, but I said, but these things, I experience them. I have to take that as the primary data in which I'm going to build my model of reality. What else are we all building our sense of reality on except our experience? And he finally blew his lid and he started yelling at me, and like literally veins popping out of his neck. He said, you just don't get it, you just don't get it. You don't understand science. He said, direct experience is not admissible as data for science. At that point, that was such a shocking thing for him to say. I was just suddenly hit with the profound sense we are in a serious epistemological crisis in science. And my response after some stunned silence was, what other kind is there? Is there any kind of experience that we have that's not a direct experience in the moment arising in consciousness? No. And he says he was referring to the notion that we need sort of like to be, objective, repeatable measurements and everything. But I said, but even that's being conveyed to us through our conscious experience, right? There was something he wasn't understanding about what I was saying. It seemed so simple, but it made me, and then over time, as I continued studying physics, I became profoundly aware of just the staggering degree to which it was like a conspiracy to leave consciousness out of the picture and to try to describe reality as if mind and consciousness were not part of it. And they had done a pretty good job of completely cutting that out of the world model. And yet I saw that when I started learning about quantum physics, I saw that all the quantum paradoxes and the things that were baffling to the physicists, they were baffling because they were coming to it from a frame of reference in which they had thrown mind and consciousness out of the picture. If you simply, my experience was that sentience, the simple fact of cognizance or awareness or consciousness, is intrinsic and primordial to the whole field of reality. It's not something that you need to derive as an epiphenomena of complex chemical reactions. And I had a lot of interactions with people when I would talk about consciousness. They were trying to isolate it as caused by a particular chemical reaction in the brain. And that's what causes consciousness. And several people had actually, when I would push them to define consciousness, they said, consciousness is it's caused by a chemical reaction inside the craniums of higher primates and humans, and the rest of the universe is not conscious. And I was like, I was definitely living in a different universe than they were. Because it seems such an obvious, simple, elegant assumption on which to base science that consciousness is fundamental, that sentience is. And it's not just in matter, but it's in space. It's in light. There's not a single thing that isn't, in a sense, an expression or partaking of a conscious experience. That being is conscious, period. And I thought, why is that so hard for the Western mind to just simply accept? Aren't they conscious? And I came to conclude that there was a lot of impairment in people's fundamental capacity for primary experience. That we had a culture that was so profoundly rewarding everybody for performing all kinds of abstract intellectual feats and gymnastics, that's where people were largely at. They were so in their head that they literally were so disconnected from just the simple experience of being conscious in the moment was something that was foreign to them. Like, I would often say to these people who were just denying and fighting with me everything I was saying, and it was because they were following an abstract mental map in their head. And I would say, can you just let that go for a minute? Can you just simply breathe and just, are you feeling anything? Can you feel, just this primary feel? Do you feel like a glow of energy around your body? And they go, no, I don't feel a glow of energy around my body. And I was like, so I had, conjured up a very peculiar mission for myself to have that experience and then plot myself right in the heart of reductionless, soulless, spiritless science, and then try to, communicate to these people that there's something beyond that. And so after a while it became just unwieldy. I realized I really need to take a lot of time and just educate myself in the existing models of the universe so that I can really be conversant in them. Because there's like a language. I need to be multilingual, speak all the languages of science at a very technical level so that I can speak to these people in a way that they feel that I'm credible, and then I can move more into the incredible areas. And so my main focus, because of this experience that I'd had, was the physics of light. I thought, well, clearly what I experienced was not the electromagnetic spectrum. It was just inherently obvious. I knew that the light, because my eyes were wide open when I had this experience. I was actually out on a sunny day, and a light that was much brighter and much more. It wasn't just a light that was brighter. It was a light that was completely moved me to the very core of my soul. It was a living, sentient, divine light, if you will, that made, by comparison, the light of the outer light of electromagnetism, the light that we see with our eyes, seemed very faint and dim by comparison. So, again, starting to study light as a physicist, but being really interested in this inner light, this light that I'd experienced, I was not prepared for the level of just severe dogma and unwillingness to consider that light is anything other than electromagnetism. We as a culture, I think, are suffering from, reductionism in general, but I think in the realm of physics, we're suffering from electromagnetic reductionism. Whenever anybody's talking about any subtle field or any consciously experienced thing like the life force or these, numinous experiences or inner light, if you can't map it as electromagnetism, it isn't real, is mostly what we have going on. And that's the challenge that a conference like this has. We are coming right up against that dogmatic assumption. And the problem is, I found that this inner light, you can't measure it with 3D material instruments, but you can measure it with the instrument of a human being. We're a much, much more sophisticated instrument than any of our electronic devices. In some ways, the electronic devices can span out to areas that are beyond our sensory reach. But there's something about the feeling capacity of a coherent and aligned human system that can sense aspects of reality that our electronic measuring systems just can't touch. And yet, because of the epistemological framework we're in, that's not acceptable for science. This huge range of direct experiences that people are having of the subtle, trans-spatio-temporal, inner subjective realm is just off limits in general to science. So I felt, my God, something has to be done about this. When I really read about and studied the scientific method, I said, there's nothing in the scientific method that says you can't actually apply this to inner experience. And yet somehow people were presenting the scientific method as if the scientific method had a proviso that said, and you can only apply this to the outer world. And so I thought, we really need to develop, apply the scientific method to consciousness, to the inner world, and develop a rigorous, sort of coherent methodology by which to explore this sort of ignored frontier. And shortly after that, I was feeling really daunted with the challenge because I was pretty much alone. Everybody I talked to was just sort of largely opposed to it. I hadn't really found, like-minded people. I was mainly still in academia and the university system. And to my great relief, I came across a book on yoga. I started reading a book on yoga, and it said, yoga is the very beginning. It was The Science of Yoga by I.K. Tomney. I picked up this book, and it said, Science of Yoga has for thousands of years been applying the scientific method to the inner dimensions of human experience. And I was like, oh, good. Good, I don't have to start off this whole thing. In fact, it's a very ancient practice. In fact, throughout all cultures and all times, it has made perfect sense that the inner dimensions of experience are fundamentally important to our sense of reality, and we are suffering from a very peculiar form of sort of psycho-spiritual disability in this culture, in which that is suspect. People don't trust their inner world. In fact, so much so that they get mind blocked to it. And I was experiencing a lot of people who, I was having, all I had to do is close my eyes, and I'm off in all these very amazing kind of visions and things like that. And I would talk to other people, and I'd say, just close your eyes, tell me what you see. And they say, it's dark. and I started realizing that that people, first of all, because of the way the culture was, I was getting, really punished and beaten up for even asking these questions. And I realized, well, most people just probably give up. They just don't want to persist in this quest, and they just go belly up and go along with doing what they can do to get supported and rewarded and get funding. And it's considered death to your funding as a scientist if you talk about consciousness and spirit, creating a spirit-based science and the inner light. And I was talking to some Russian colleagues of mine who were deeply into that, and they came over to the West, and they said, I said, well, they wrote up some proposals for funding. It was completely leaving out all of that. And I said, well, why didn't you talk about what you're really interested in? They said, well, we found that over here in the West, consciousness means no funding. And so they said, we're of course really interested in it, but we can't mention it at all in our proposals, because if we do, nobody will fund us. I mean, that is such a peculiar state of affairs. And that's what caused me to coin a long time the word that we need epistemotherapy. We need to really check in to how is it that this one notion of how we know things, which is through this sort of notion of objective observation of outer phenomena that can be repeatedly demonstrated or measured with instruments, and then put through a rational process and mapped into a sort of through the scientific method, come up with a theory explaining that, which then you sort of buy into that theory so deeply that it becomes a filter that you can't see anything new coming in. How has that gained ascendancy such that there's this hubris of people who hold that view that all other ways of knowing are just, these primitive sort of atavistic remnants of a pre-rational time, and that we just need to get rid of them. Whereas there are many, many modes of knowing. There are ways of knowing that completely don't involve the rational mind. In fact, the rational mind is the main impediment to these ways of knowing, which don't involve creating the artificial subject-object dichotomy. They involve just direct, what's called gnosis, or just direct experience, such that another way to put it, I like to be called knowledge through identity, in which you know something through becoming one with what you know. And so that the knower and the known are no longer two distinct domains. That whole mode of knowing is relegated to and looked down upon by science, where it seems to me, my experience and many people I've talked to, is that every mode of knowing that you can engage teaches you something important about reality. And they may be really different modalities of exploring the mysterious sort of features of reality, kind of like the elephant and the blind man story. All these people describing an elephant with blindfolds on, they all describe very different things, but they're all describing the elephant. I think reality is like that. It has all these different properties, and to insist that only one part of the elephant is reality, or like only the trunk, only people are describing the trunk or describing the true thing, that's very much like what we're doing in our Western scientific epistemology. And so I am proposing what I call a full spectrum epistemology, one in which we put all ways of knowing on equal footing, and we accept them all as an important portal into experiencing reality. And we allow ourselves to be enhanced and see all of them as portholes into the mystery of existence. And that seems like such a sort of sane, obvious thing to do, but it's hard to get that across, to put it mildly, because it's a deeply ingrained tendency in this culture. And so my initial explorations into light showed me that the same problem pervades the whole kind of Western intellectual approach to reality. And my attempts to talk about this other kind of light pretty much fell on deaf ears. And I said, what about, I talked to all these scientists, and I said, what about, the light, what about the light that's referred to in literature and poetry, the light of the heart, the light of understanding, seeing the light, the light of compassion, They say, oh, those are all just poetic metaphors. It's not real light. And I said, what if it's not? What if there really is this kind of light, another kind of light that transcends electromagnetism, that in a sense is a higher dimensional kind of light? And it's not the light that we see with our eyes, but it's the light by which we see. That it's actually conscious, that this higher dimensional light or this inner light is conscious light. It's consciousness itself. And that we are that light. And it's that light that we are that is presently enabling us to have this experience. The fundamental mystery, I think, of existence, how can we even be having an experience? And you talk to scientists in the reductionist sort of materialist framework, and this is the obvious question. They're saying we're just an assemblage of dead, inanimate matter. And I say, well, okay, how can that matter be having an experience? And they always, if you're familiar with it, this is now fortunately been formulated like 17 years after I had these experiences, and went through all kinds of really difficult ordeals torture actually as a result of asking these questions. Finally, somebody came forth, and David Chalmers formalized it and it was on the cover of Scientific American exactly 17 years after I'd had these experiences. And he formulated it in a way, and he had enough credentials and credibility, and he was a philosopher, and he formulated what he called the hard problem of consciousness. And he said that this issue of how can we be conscious, how is it that we can be having an experience at all, is the reductionists who assume that there is basically inanimate matter, that their attempt to try to understand consciousness by complex electrochemical reactions in the brain, and if you just get a complex enough dynamic going on, somehow, poof, it becomes conscious. He called that the easy problem. And he says they're all doing the easy problem. The hard problem is this fundamental question of how is it that we can be aware? Where does awareness come from? And he wrote several books about it, and it triggered a huge sort of, in a sense, a renaissance or an opening of the minds of reductionism to this factor of consciousness. And it started a whole series of conferences in Tucson that are still going on called Towards the Science of Consciousness. And I actually went to the second one, and I was really shocked. I kept thinking, okay, well, they're saying toward the science of consciousness, because it was a lot of the reductionists, but they were at least willing to talk about this. And the very first seminar I went to, of the first day, it was a huge plenary session. There were thousands of people in a gigantic room, and there was this guy named Daniel Dennett who was up there who had written this book called Consciousness Explained. And it really should be Consciousness Explained Away, because he was up there basically saying consciousness doesn't exist, that it's a hallucination, and that we're not conscious. And I was thinking, oh God, I thought I was coming here to see scientists talk about consciousness, and he laid out this whole thing just eliminating consciousness from the universe. And then at one point somebody got up and said, so from your point of view, you're saying that you're a zombie. And he said, exactly, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm a zombie, you're a zombie, we're all zombies. And he came back to the conference the next day with a t-shirt saying, we're all zombies. And I was like thinking, God, we've got a way to go. And just the fact that, here's a whole room of people who are clearly, apparently conscious, aren't they? And yet a fairly large number of them was like going really happy to be told they were zombies and that consciousness doesn't exist. It really dramatized to me how much we need to raise consciousness on the planet, and how these fundamental issues are really at the heart of our entire social, political, economic, and sort of psycho-spiritual system. The environmental crisis, all of these things, everything really comes down to a crisis, a spiritual crisis, a crisis in human consciousness. And all these attempts to fix it out there without really addressing the source of it, which is, in a sense, a crippled capacity to experience being, and that our natural faculties, our natural capacities for perception are so vast and open-ended, and we tend to have been conditioned into using a very truncated, small range of our full capacities. You know, those of us who are here at this conference, I'm sure we wouldn't be here at this conference if we hadn't had some experiential contact with a realm that you could at least call the subtle realm, or a realm that sort of defies, you know, just the kind of solid, you know, hard materialist sense of reality. And yet, you know, that is really the growing edge, I think, of science. So what I did, I'd studied a lot of physics and got very into mathematics, which I really loved, and I found mathematics to be an incredibly beautiful way to explore the inner worlds, and I started looking at physics, and physics was using all of these multidimensional theories, and they would describe the universe as, you know, a 10 or 11 dimensional structure, and I was like thinking, great, this is really fantastic. They're starting to really, you know, be aware we're in a multidimensional universe, and we're in the multiverse. And then I would go to these people and meet the people who came up with these theories, and they'd say, oh, we don't really believe in those dimensions. He says, they're just mathematical tricks to get the right answer in the real world, which is the three-dimensional world, or the four-dimensional space-time continuum. I said, you've got to be kidding. It works so well. You know, you admit that you can't possibly even describe the so-called material world without going into these higher dimensions, but you don't even believe in them? And it was a pervasive phenomenon. I found one physicist, Saul Paul Sirog, who actually, it was such a breath of fresh air, because he was deeply trained in mathematical physics, but he had also had all kinds of, you know, mystical and numinous experiences, such that he was the first person I found, and there are more and more of them now, but who actually believes that the higher dimensional modeling that's going on in physics is actually describing the architecture of the spiritual worlds, and that what is being talked about in spirituality and all the descriptions of the higher light worlds or the different planes of being, he said that's what we're describing with these multidimensional theories. And he says, yeah, it's true. Most people who are really good at the math and are doing these theories just don't believe them, because they haven't had experiential access to them. And it's my contention that over time we're going to see more and more people having experiences that they just can't account for, and finding the work that's already been done from sort of just pure math to describing this beautiful sort of crystalline multidimensional architecture reality. They're finding that that's actually describing the universe that we are consciously awakening into. And so I thought, well, let's just try to, you know, not get into too many dimensions at once. Clearly we really need to help people take baby steps out of the third and fourth dimension, you know, and the whole notion of the fourth dimension, which Einstein really helped us be aware of. But there's fundamental problems with the space-time continuum, and the very notion of space and time as has become the new dogma of physics. You cannot talk about anything that violates the sacrosanct model of space-time, or that we call Minkowskian space-time, the notion that everything is a four-dimensional space-time continuum. There's major problems with that. Number one being that Einstein said time is the fourth dimension. But you look in a space-time diagram or in any of the equations, and time is little t. Time is not the fourth dimension. Time is still treated as a point moving unidirectionally along a line. In other words, he says time is the fourth dimension, but in practice time is the first dimension. And this notion, this linear notion of time, is one of the deepest dogmas that I think is immobilizing our capacity to understand, you know, the full, you know, creative and multidimensional nature of reality. And I think it's really crippling our consciousness. It's like a spell. I call it the linear time spell. And it has been formalized at the foundations of physics such that every equation in physics, except a few, have this little t in it. And if that is fundamentally erroneous, which I contend that it is, what does that say about all of physics? All the equations are wrong. You know, they have a certain, it's been compelling because if you treat time as a linear sequence and you assume that, it's very good for describing mechanical processes unfolding in time, as if time is actually a big line going into the future. It works well. It corresponds with experience to a certain degree, and so it's become very compelling. However, the simple fact of a mystical experience, or just even a simple quiet experience in meditation, which you actually contemplate the present moment enough, and you can just come into phase with the present moment in such a way you actually discover that time is not actually happening in a very real sense, that in consciousness there's simply the now. But the reason it's so compelling to think that time is happening is because we have axiomatically defined time. It's a definitional problem. We've defined time in terms of the motion of matter and energy in space. And so thereby we have become immobilized in our thinking, and people have forgotten that that's just an arbitrary definition of time, that we've defined time in terms of how long it takes to get from point A to point B, or the motion of hands around a clock. Now that's a three-dimensional object moving in space, and yet we say it's measuring time. What is it really measuring? It was a stunning realization for me to suddenly realize, my God, the whole human race right now is so profoundly stuck in the third dimension, and they're mind blocked to being able to imagine anything beyond it, that this mysterious, invisible, indivisible reality we know as time, which is a fundamental part of our conscious experience, but it's not a material thing. You can't really point to time. In fact, time has a much more mysterious property than space, because space, in a sense, has a kind of material quality, because you can sort of measure things. Space itself, which we'll get into later, which is a really paradigm-shattering thing when you discover the profound transformations of our understanding of the fundamentals in physics. I'm going to go through them: time, space, light, and consciousness. Well, if you actually go into physics and you start talking to people, you'll see there is no agreement about the fundamentals. Our space is, there's a very formal definition of space that is pervasive, but it doesn't fit with all kinds of other data. The same thing with time, the same thing with mass. Fundamental things like mass, force, charge, all these things that are the elemental things out of which these much more complex theories are built. If you actually look at them carefully enough, you find that they are not on solid footing. And so that's really been my focus, is the fundamentals of physics, and redefining them in a way such that it allows a world model that's actually supports and engenders a worldview that is congruent with what it's like to actually be conscious. Because that was my experience of science. I would say, well, those are very amazing models, but I'm not experiencing anything like that. A great example now is superstring theory. Superstring theory is all the rage, and yet there is not one single part of the theory that in any way corresponds to or can be tested, experimentally. So it's all a sense of very elaborate mental abstraction that people just love. They love to play around in that realm of abstraction. But it has no phenomenological congruence or utility. It doesn't relate to what it feels like to be alive. It's fancy mathematical models that you can just get. The mind, and especially the Western intellect, just gets so into and loves to play in those realms. But meanwhile, we have a civilization that's threatening to destroy the biosphere. We're riddled with wars. We have huge inequity between the rich and the poor all over the planet. There's very serious problems that we need to address. And some of the best minds of the Western world are just going off into their ivory towers and being fascinated with these fancy mathematical models. It seems like a misappropriation of where attention needs to be put. And so my the more I saw this, the more I saw that science, which has the potential to be of such service to humanity, of such service to helping create the foundations for a world that works for everybody, wasn't doing that at all. In fact, it was getting massively deflected and really not having a social conscience, and which I felt was unethical. And so I thought we need to come up with a really simple, elegant world model that everybody can agree on, and then we can free up all these millions of minds to actually work on creating a world in which we can all love each other and live together harmoniously. That seemed a much more important thing than spending all your time in these very abstract realms arguing about minutiae, about theories you could never even test, which is honestly hundreds of thousands of people are doing that right now, and there's whole universities supporting them, and huge amounts of money is going to that, and meanwhile we have major crises on the planet that need to be addressed. And so that was my mission. This is in my early 20s. I thought, well, let's just come up with a simple, elegant model that can really explain things, and then once we can agree on that, let's work on the more important social crises, like the fact that we're all addicted to fossil fuel, and it's a completely unsustainable resource. Let's develop a new technological infrastructure that we're not dependent on it. Let's stop having to destroy and pollute the environment in order to have energy. And so, getting back to the time spell and the role that plays in this whole sort of geopolitical crisis, it became clear to me after a while that this assumption, this definitional assumption that time is defined in terms of motion and space. In fact, it's pretty much hard to imagine time without motion because of the way time is defined. So people will often say, well, in fact, there's a very funny dramatization of this problem in physics. There's right now it's been in the Scientific American and a bunch of magazines lately. They actually work out some unified theories that involve 4 or 5 or 6 dimensional theories, and time, the little t, drops out of the equation. And they call this a huge crisis. They call it the crisis of time. And there's a whole article on the crisis of time, and I read it, and it's like, we can't find a way to put little t into higher dimensions. And to me, it's like obvious. It's like there isn't little t in higher dimensions. Time is not even happening in this dimension. Time is actually, what I've come to understand, linear time is a chronic hallucination induced by an unintegrated nervous system that is continuing to hallucinate that it's being dragged into the future and away from the past because it can't center itself in the now moment. And it's very much like, a mystical view would say, well, there's a single moment. There's the now. And everything is actually happening in the now. Whereas the way we have been trained to perceive things, because we're so focused on the third dimension, in fact, the whole mammalian brain is very outward focused. And, this is a recurrent theme, Elliot Dasher's presentation, where she talked about these oscillations in history between the inner way and the outer way, and how they tend to be out of phase with each other. I feel now, more than ever, is the imperative to bring the inner and the outer perspectives together and integrate them and synthesize them. Those represent 2 fundamental epistemologies, and they're not in conflict. In fact, integrating them together gives you a much more full spectrum view of reality. And looking at over history how they've not come together, I feel like if we cannot bring those together, I think we really may be imperiling our survival, because that mind split is having so many repercussions throughout our entire human world. It's just devastating. Well, so what about perceiving the moment? Instead of just being able to center our minds in the singular now, we experience the singular now, and then the configuration of matter and energy around us changes, the next moment. We think just because matter and energy changes around that means a new moment has happened. And then another reconfiguration and a new moment. So we say, oh, there's a whole series of moments. And then we string them along in a line, and has it ever occurred to people that we just might be in an iterative feedback loop, perceiving the singular now moment over and over again in a way that we've postulated that there's a whole series of moments and strung them out on a line and become strung out in linear time. I find that this linear time notion, which is formalized into all the equations of physics, has literally gotten imprinted into the fundamental structure of our global economic system, our whole socio-political system, and it has profound impact on the whole pattern of human life. The way that we have equated this linear artificial mental construct of time that tied to the clock with then another artificial construct called money. Time is money. The profound effect that dogma is having on the entire way the whole human race, spends its time, spends its experience on Earth, is that it regiments everybody into a pattern in which you have to actually exchange your linear time units for linear money or value units, or else you can't biologically survive. It gets tied to our survival, so it then brings up this fear. And so people become fear-driven to actually have to find some way to make money. And so the consequences of that way of making money become less important. If we're polluting the environment, making our money, well, too bad, we've got to make money. And so this whole time is money dogma, which is driven at a fundamental level by the linear time assumption, is one of the driving forces behind the desecration of the biosphere. So that's why I'm constantly brought back to these fundamental things in physics, that if you can find a way to free your mind from them and actually discover that they are arbitrary definitions, that then everything else that we are doing as a human family are sort of premised on these assumptions. And you find out that they're not even true, and that they're actually inadequate assumptions. It makes me see the profound role that fundamental physics has to social activism. That actually it's going to be really hard to the whole environmental movement and all of the things that are trying to create change, if they're not really realizing that the fundamental core assumptions at the root of our world model are wrong, and that changing those will automatically create a framework, a new worldview in which it just is absolutely untenable to be destroying and desecrating our life support system in order to generate, artificial units of value, which are then tied into all kinds of ways that we disassociate ourselves from the Earth and from a sense of connectedness to the Earth. We talk about the biosphere like it's something else. Come on, we are the biosphere. I mean, we are absolutely nothing but the biosphere. And yet, there's this way of talking in which we're always talking about something else. And it happens also when it comes to physics, in which we're talking about light or space and time. There's something else. But, I mean, come on, we're in space. When we're talking about space, when we're talking about light, we're talking about ourselves. And so ultimately these definitions in physics have profound repercussions on our identity, on our fundamental sense of who we are. And so that's, again, another reason why going back to the fundamentals and exploring them is so important. And so what I've come up with is a way of reformulating all of physics without little t. But it requires just to, suspend those axioms. And, we know from geometry is a good example of where a geometric system like Euclidean geometry, there's a set of axioms, there's a set of givens which are unquestioned assumptions that can't be proven, but they're just assumed. And so you buy into these assumptions, and then everything else that can be done in that geometry, that mathematical universe, certain things are possible or impossible once you buy into those axioms. And what I did a lot of work in geometry and mathematics, and the whole process of axiomatic set theory and the proofs that unfold from it. I realized this is a very beautiful way of analyzing the way belief systems work, and the way we assemble our sense of reality moment by moment. Each of us is operating out of an axiomatic set, which is a more rigorous way of saying belief system. And so I like the term axiomatic set instead of belief system because it's more precise and rigorous, and you can actually break it down. Like, okay, the belief systems are the total set of axioms, but what is it composed of? And at any given moment, the axiomatic set that we're operating out of instantaneously causes us to be having an experience that is the consequence of that axiomatic set. It's like in mathematics, you work it out longhand. You have the axioms, and if you want to see is something possible or impossible, you have to work out a proof based on those axioms. But it's like we are doing that at light speed every minute. We are constructing an experience of reality that is a perfect result of our axiomatic set. And it's like we as a culture have forgotten what the axioms are, and forgotten that they are assumptions and that they're givens.
Internalized good.
Yes. That's he mentioned Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which has profound implications for our fundamental understanding of the nature of these axiomatic sets. Because Gödel was able to show that no single axiomatic set can be complete and consistent. And this is what science was trying to do. This was the whole scientific program worldwide for centuries. They were looking for the ultimate theory of everything. They still are looking for the ultimate theory of everything. But a lot of these people who are doing that have forgotten about Kurt Gödel's work, which showed in the very rigorous, logical way, he sort of turned logic to look in upon itself and came up with a fabulously important result that basically said that the entire program of trying to find a complete and consistent world model will inherently fail, because there is no complete and consistent axiomatic set. Yes?
It's contingent. It's only good for certain.
Well, for finite axiomatic sets. And so axiomatic sets that are based on, finite assumptions, which if you're translating Gödel's work into the human realm, if you take his results and then you look at it in terms of the axiomatic sets, which are belief systems, I find finite axiomatic sets are axiomatic sets based on the logic of linear space and time. And most people's sense of the universe has sort of been based on those kind of axioms. And so if you're using, spatiotemporal axiomatic set, he says there's no way that can give you a complete and consistent model of reality. And this is a good divergence, because Gödel's work is very important, and one of the simplest ways I've found to convey the essence of Gödel's work, which if you read it, it's fairly abstract mathematical logic, but his conclusion is that no single axiomatic set can be both, finite axiomatic set can be both complete and consistent. A simple way of grasping that fundamental principle, and it's quite common sense, is imagine a circle. Imagine a circle representing all possible viewpoints, or all possible axiomatic sets, all possible belief systems, such that a little arc on the circle represents, a worldview, which is a set of beliefs that work, but it's an arc. Now, if you want to go towards having a more complete worldview, you have to expand the arc. And as you expand, as soon as you go beyond 180 degrees, suddenly you're including an axiomatic set that's the exact anti-axiomatic set to the other one, that negates and denies the other one. And because the desire to have consistency is the desire to not have contradictions in your model, you then retreat back into less than 180 degrees. So you can have consistency at the expense of completeness, at the expense of going full circle. But if you want to be complete, you have to have a situation in which two-valued logic no longer holds. The Aristotelian logic of, the sort of dualistic black and white two-valued logic doesn't hold. Once you go past the 180-degree point, you have to acknowledge that yes, no, both, and neither are the case. And that takes you to four-valued logic, which is actually a logic that profoundly enables one to relate to the larger sphere of reality, in which you can entertain a whole range of different viewpoints and different worldviews. You don't have to necessarily buy into them and identify with them, but you can see that they each have value, they each have a measure of truth, and that just like with the epistemologies, being able to embrace all ways of knowing and see them all as valuable, all points of view each have a measure of truth, but none of them is the truth in and of itself, truth with a capital T. And what we have, when people take their axiomatic set to be the truth with a capital T, you have something called fanaticism, which is rampant in the world today. It's called also fundamentalism. It's an error, a misunderstanding of the nature of belief systems and the nature of how they reflect the mind and reality, such that, it's my axiomatic set equals reality or truth with a capital T, and therefore anybody else's view is just wrong, and you have to be in conflict with them. We have that is racking our world with violence today. These huge ethnic, these conflicts, like the fundamentalist Christians versus the fundamentalist Muslims. It's a nightmare. And they're arguing over whose definition of God and love is right. And they're killing each other. I mean, it's hard to believe, but it's really happening. And it's tragic beyond belief. And so we really need, the nature of belief systems and how they operate, I think is critical to resolving the world crisis. Once you can inform these people that, hey, your viewpoint is, it has a measure of truth, but so does this person's viewpoint. In fact, one of the great things I like about the nature of viewpoints is the great leveler is, in a very real sense, we're all wrong. We can all be humbled because no one viewpoint is ever going to embrace reality. Reality is beyond belief. Reality is something that you need to actually disencumber yourself from belief systems to go into experiencing. And that's what's so unique about Buddhism as a so-called religion, because it's fundamentally different than the Western Judeo-Christian and Islamic religions. They're not telling you to believe anything. They're actually saying, doubt everything until you've proved it to be true in your own experience. That's fundamentally different than just believe in Jesus and you'll be saved. Because the problem is, when somebody tells you just believe in this, you can try to do it, and you can really make an effort to try to believe it, but there's always going to be a little bit of doubt until you have a direct experience that allows you to have certainty. And when you have that direct experience, it generally expands you out beyond the limitations of just a fanatical belief. But so the fundamentalism and fanaticism is a manifestation of people trying to make a mental model just, be the ultimate model of reality, and then putting sort of spiritual or divine eschatological consequences for whether you have that belief or not. I think there should be just a general sort of forgiveness and pardon to everyone for having belief systems at all. And we should just realize that there is a profound, there's something that unites us much, much more profoundly than the power of differing belief systems to separate us. But people are not in touch with that. That is, the unified field, and that is this all-connecting field. And it's the physics, you might say, of that field is the physics of how it is that every belief system, that what you believe becomes the case to you according to the degree which you believe it. There's a fundamental principle or a law of mind that I've discerned from, after studying physics for a long time, I thought I really need to study all the world's scriptures too, because I felt in a lot of the things I was trying to bring into physics, they were being described in the scriptures, but then the scriptures was not being rigorous enough to deal with the material realm in a rigorous way. So the scientists had thrown out the scriptures. People who were really into the scriptures were totally onto something that was the scientists weren't even interested in. They thought those people are just irrational, wacky people, and they have a long way to go until they evolve our rational coherence. By who? No, I haven't. Oh, her new book. Yeah, I saw it. I saw that it was called that, about the Gospel of St. Thomas.
Out of Thomas 70.
Mm-hmm.
Out that which is within you and set you free.
Exactly. Yeah, and also in the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus says, until you make the inner as the outer, and the male as the female, and basically resolve all these dualities, you really won't enter the kingdom, so to speak. So this point of view that well, I think at this point it might be good to just start entering into I'll go on. What I found from reading the scriptures was I was reading the scriptures with the mind of a physicist. What's the fundamental principle? And I figured that there was probably one very simple thing, or very few very simple things they were all trying to get across, but they were all in their own culturally bound sort of symbolic sets of stories and traditions and everything, so that I was trying to see through all that. And I saw a lot of profound similarities, such that there were almost identical things being said by Jesus in the Bible at the Sermon on the Mount, and Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, and amazing congruences when you really study the scriptures. It's just staggering. How could we be having all these conflicts over this stuff? And yet, I was really trying to operationalize it and boil it down, and I figured one of the most essential points that I see all the world scriptures, and not just all the world scriptures, but many self-help books and psychology, and they're really trying to get across this fundamental principle that seems to me to be an operative principle in mind and consciousness, very much like that's all pervading, that's a part of the nature of the field of consciousness, almost like the law of gravity pervades the whole material universe. I would say it's, and you find it in every scripture, but the most essential statement in words that I found of it is in the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, and it says, "As a thing is viewed, so it appears." And that's a very, very simple and elegant statement of the fact that the act of viewing the world is actually not separate from evoking its appearance, and that what we're seeing as a supposed world out there is actually a reflex of the way we're looking at it, and that we have profound power to constantly self-reflect and inquire, what is my axiomatic set in this moment? Because whatever it is, it's causing me to be having this experience. And so to develop the capacity for self-referral and self-reflection is one of the chief capacities and competences that the human race needs to regenerate in order to wake up and move on in its evolution of consciousness. The human race is profoundly trained into object referral, referring everything out there and seeing the problems and the causes and attempting to impose the solutions out there without realizing that they are fundamentally, a reflex of how we're viewing the world. And this as viewed so appears thing, to me, contemplating that intensively has been one of the most liberating things to contemplate, because it keeps bringing it back to you're 100% responsible for your experience. That everything that's appearing out there is actually in no way separate from you. In fact, it is the display of your own consciousness. Everything going on in your experience, very much like, and I find this a very descriptive, precise way of talking about it, very much like a dream. Like, many of the world's mystical traditions literally say, this universe is a dream. We are dreaming. And that there's no way you can distinguish, a dream that you're having at night from your waking state experience. And what does it mean for the universe to be a dream? Well, the word dream has some problems, because when, this is one of the things I was also experiencing when I had these experiences. I thought, well, we're dreaming. This is a dream, and I'm becoming lucid in the dream and realizing that we're dreaming, and then telling the other dream characters, who I realize if I'm lucid in a dream, they're all me, telling them that we're dreaming didn't go over very well. And it was like, and so what it means to say the universe is a dream is basically to say that it is a projection of mind. That in the sense that what we see out there is a reflection, a projection of our consciousness, in no way separate from it. In an ordinary night dream, that you're not lucid, you fall under the spell of the dream. One of the main features of an ordinary non-lucid dream is you think it's real. Look, people think this is real. They're not lucid. When you start to wake up and discover this, in which the boundaries between the inner and outer starts to dissolve, and you start to see that the outer is a perfectly lawful reflection of something going on deep in consciousness that is outpicturing itself and representing itself as the whole material dream, you start to discover that who are all these other people? If you become lucid in a dream, if you have a non-lucid dream, you wake up, you go, oh, I was dreaming. All those people who I thought were other people were all me. They were all facets of my psyche. If you go to any dream analyst, that's what they'll say. All the different figures in your dream are different parts of you, sort of symbolically represented in the dream. Well, what if we were to apply that to this waking state, so-called waking state? It's a potential waking state. We have the potential to be awake in this state. And if you are awake in this dream, you start realizing that we are all each other's dream characters. And I think that's a profound way to relate to things, because then you start to realize that there's the literal level of reality, but there's also the symbolic level. And that to be able to see things symbolically is a faculty of consciousness that I think we need to generate, because just as when you interpret a dream after you've woke up, you often see these very profound symbolic meanings in them. There's very profound symbolic meanings in our life. And I think it's a fantastic practice one of the ways to just enhance this is like at the end of your day, before you're ready to go to sleep, just pretend like you just woke up and that whole day was your dream. And then interpret the dream. Who were all those people? What did they which parts of me do they all represent? What's going on? And that's a bit much for some people, because it means radically taking responsibility for the whole universe, which is actually what we're being called to do. But it's a bit daunting. People would really rather stay asleep, stay non-lucid, because they don't want to they can hardly take responsibility for their apparent individual. Dealing with the whole universe seems a little bit much, but it's what we're all being called to do, and we don't have to do it alone.
Well, it's not a new idea. Prospero and the Tempest, the new our rebels and now are ended, so on and so on.
Yeah, right.
And we are such a stuff
as dreams are made of. Exactly. This is a perennial idea, and I'm suggesting it be brought forth very seriously at the leading edge of physics and mathematics and science, inquiring into that, because if you really study the implications of quantum physics and general relativity and the multidimensional multiverse models, which are out there, this is what is really being put forth as the best models of reality. The implication is that the universe is a dream. I sort of wanted to imagine a headline on the headlines of papers. Science discovers the universe to be a dream. And just as a lucidity prompt to try to wake people up, because I think that it can enable a much more compassionate universe in which we're all relating to each other as dream characters. So then, if there's a particularly irritating dream character, rather than being in the normal mode in which you're contracting into your separate self and you have real problems with that person, it forces you into self-referral. Like, what part of myself is this person giving me the opportunity to relate to, that I really need to learn who to embrace more? And so that perspective, of coming out of as viewed, so appears, I have been able to take that principle, as viewed, so appears, and reduce it even more to an actual equation, such that equation, from that single equation, which is basically describing the fundamental principle of self-reflection, which is a principle in the nature of light itself, of the light of consciousness itself, you can then derive very rigorously all the laws of matter and energy of space and time from that equation, and all the moral and ethical principles of the world's spiritual traditions, all from a single equation, all from one mystic law, which is a law inherent in light. But here we go again. You talk to physicists, they'll go, well, how is that in Maxwell's equations? Because to physicists, Maxwell's equations is the be-all and end-all of what we know about light. Now, we heard Carl Merritt present to us that even Maxwell's equations is a truncated view of light. They've left out a whole component of oscillation. The longitudinal component has been thrown out. So, how symbolic is it that our Western culture at this time has been operating off of a fundamentally flawed model of even three-dimensional light, Not to mention the idea that there's more to light than meets the eye, and that light may be a really multidimensional field, and that light actually may be consciousness itself. So what I've worked out, and it's a very simple, elegant thing, I find that a lot of physics tends to get way too complicated, and to me that's always a sign that they're off course. Because if you really want a model of reality that has phenomenological congruence that you can relate to as a living person, how does what this model is saying, relate to my direct experience? You want a model that actually is accessible. I think it's a criterion of any good scientist to be able to explain all their most abstract theories to anybody without mathematics. And if they can't do that, I don't think they really understand it. You know, they may understand the technical minutia of their abstract thought form, but how is it relevant to ordinary people? I think that's a very important thing, because that's the only thing that's really going to change the world. Otherwise, we're, again, just in this ivory towerism of just being fascinated with our mind formations, while we have a world that is just going into greater and greater chaos and serious crisis. And so what I have developed is a very simple proposition to say that light actually is a multidimensional spectrum, and that not just people are very familiar with the spectrum of frequencies, and so a lot of spiritual people are having these experiences of subtle energy or subtle light always talk about as, it's higher frequency energy, but to a physicist that means it's still within the third dimension. You can have as high a frequency as you want still in the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's still oscillating within 3D. I'm saying we need to not only expand our understandings of light horizontally in 3D, we need to see that there's a hierarchy, or a holarchy, I prefer, of higher dimensions of light, in which there is such a thing as four-dimensional light, which is simply, it's exactly like three-dimensional light with one extra degree of freedom, one extra degree of oscillation. And it's a degree of oscillation that's hard for us to imagine because we're so focused in 3D. We're like 3D flatlanders. And to imagine an extra axis in the coordinate system is hard for us. But mathematicians have no trouble with this. They just create a four-dimensional model, and you can work out all kinds of precise dynamics in higher dimensions. And what I found is if you take Maxwell's equations, which are as flawed as they are, just start with that, and ideally you put the longitudinal component back in, and so that you're actually describing the full range of oscillations in three dimensions, and then you just take those equations and you just put in one more variable. You just add another degree of freedom, another dimension. So it's the same equations, but it's describing four-dimensional light. And then what's very interesting about that is, and you can make five-dimensional light and six-dimensional light all the way up. And then you actually look at those equations, and so, they can be kind of complicated equations. So I've worked it out with computers to look at the dynamics of higher dimensional light. And it turns out that the dynamics of higher dimensional light looks very much like there's all kinds of changes and dynamics that look very much like topological changes, and it actually turns out to beautifully map psychological transformations. And so what I came to realize is that this higher dimensional light, people are often thinking of, the higher dimension is something we can't imagine where the fourth dimension or the fifth dimension is, because we tend to be so much in the perceptual sphere of the third dimension. Well, the higher dimensions are found by looking within. It's what all the mystics have been calling for us to do, look within. And, to look within is to actually discover spiritual freedom. Well, this freedom that you find by really being able to look within is perfectly correlating to these higher degrees of freedom, and a degree of freedom equals a dimension. So you're actually exploring higher dimensions by learning to direct your consciousness to within. And within doesn't necessarily mean just close your eyes and it's inside your body. It's a particular mode of having consciousness to look back upon itself. And there's this universal claim of people having these incredibly expansive experiences of going into a much freer space inside their consciousness, inside their mind. And so I think it's a simple, elegant, unifying assumption to make, is that this higher dimensional light is actually the substance of which our inner life, our subjective world is woven out of. And that all these amazing inner experiences, which have been sort of ignored by science, are literally us exploring higher dimensions. And that we are totally multidimensional beings, and that we can directly experience these higher dimensions, and we can come up with an elegant scientific model of them that's mathematically precise and rigorous, just as we've done in the third dimension. And the conquest, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use that word. It's a bad word from the old paradigm. The exploration of higher dimensions is something that's open to all of us, and we don't need a fancy, particle accelerator or a lab, smashing particles into each other, at billions of electron volts. I mean, to me, that's a very violent approach to understanding nature. And there's still movement to still spend billions of dollars sort of violently smashing matter into itself harder and harder, as if the more violent you get, you're going to force nature to reveal her secrets to you. It's a very interesting epistemology, and I think it's very off course, and an expression of the problem that we're trying to find a solution to. That approach to nature, I don't think, is going to lead to a harmonious and peaceful world that works for everyone. They're trying to find evidence for their very disconnected abstract theories, and it's questionable if they even will, but it's certain that even if they do find a correlation to smashing particles together with their theories, it's not going to have any social or redeemable value. And so this model of the inner light, that the inner light is higher dimensional light, this gives a very, very profound framework in which to, in a rigorous and coherent way, talk about all the subtle energies. The subtle energies are, when people experience subtle energies, rather than saying, which drives scientists crazy and causes them to think people who talk about subtle energies are just very non-rigorous at best. It's good to watch for using the term, it's higher frequency energy. It's better to say it's higher dimensional energy. Now, that might sound even weirder to them, but I think it's more rigorous. It fits in a very coherent frame, and just the simple assumption that there's more to light than meets the eye, that light has many dimensions to it, as well as having this full spectrum in 3 dimensions. It's just a simple as above, so below principle. And so if we're going to look at this whole material world as the so below, then there's a natural higher dimensional reflection. It's as simple and elegant as what Plato talked about in his cave analogy, when he said humans are like trapped in the back of a cave, sort of strapped in such that they can only see the shadows on the wall of the cave. Meanwhile, there's a real world out there which is casting the shadows, and we have come to just equate the shadows with reality. And then anybody who happens to get out of the cave and go out and experience the real colorful 3-dimensional world out there, comes back into the cave and tries to tell people about it, they are convinced that person has completely lost their mind, and that for their own good, we're going to strap you back in a chair and make you look at those shadows, because that's reality. And that's very much what happens to people in this culture who have mystical experiences and explore the higher dimensions within, and then try to talk to other people about them. They will send you to a mental hospital and drug you until you are totally, recant that there really is. Yeah?
Would this be a good time for a break?
Yeah, sure.
And could we answer a question?
Sure.
How did you stay out of the mental hospital?
I didn't. That was part of my journey.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where are your parents with your journey now?
My parents have gone through quite a lot of changes. My mother and my father got divorced because my mother basically saw that I was really onto something and that I wasn't crazy, whereas my father was a hardcore reductionist materialist geneticist, and who had discovered the cause of schizophrenia in a mutant brain protein. And so when I started talking to him about my experiences, he could only conclude that I must have the mutant brain protein. And so he locked me up on that basis. And that caused this rift between my parents, such that my parents got divorced. And she has gone on to really have a spiritual awakening. About 10 years later, she started having similar experiences, and she was calling me, telling me all of her wild experiences, and it was just like really an amazing thing. So, and my father, just in the very last year or so, has started really dilating his mind because as a result of the death of his wife, which my wife also passed away. In fact, Elizabeth Targ, who was one of the women who was at the front of Jim Oshman's residency, in the connection between prayer, intentionality in prayer and healing, and she did these fantastic projects, on distant healing and prayer, and very mysteriously and tragically, she contracted glioblastoma, which was the very disease that she was doing a prayer study on, and it was very, very difficult to lose her. But in a very real sense, I don't feel I've really lost her, because I'm continuing to have all kinds of profound experiences of communication with her. I believe she's continuing her dedicated research and loving service to, within the larger multi-dimensional sphere, and hundreds of other people are having experiences of her communicating with them, and it's this very profound thing. So in a very real sense, I don't really feel like she's gone. I feel like we're still married. I just have a interdimensional marriage, and that's a very profound thing. Yeah, I'm wearing both of our rings. Well, shortly after Elizabeth died, which was a huge ordeal for all of our families, because we had just got married. She died 10 weeks after we got married, and that really shook up not just everybody who knew her, and it was quite an intense drama to be in the midst of, and really, really hard. And my father was really moved by it, because, his son, who he thought had serious biochemical imbalances in his brain, who was hallucinating all this nonsense for years, has finally, got it together and got married, and then also Elizabeth's studies were a real challenge to his reality, and meeting Elizabeth's father, Russell, was a real, talk about a paradigm clash between my father and Russell. And Russell had a very beautiful way of disarming my father's reductionism, because he'd start just telling him about all the remote viewing data, and just saying, and my father had never heard of this, and he says, well, clearly you haven't been reading literature, He says, there's mountains of work done on this, and they've done whole meta-analysis of all this, and it's, it's way beyond 10 trillion to 1 to believe that this isn't exactly how reality works. We live in this larger non-local reality. And that wasn't hard for my father to ingest, but then he actually said to Russell, well, I hope you're, if that's true, that's pretty amazing, but I hope you're not going to bring God into it, because I'm an atheist. And Russell said, what is silly belief system? And my father's really disarmed. He said, and Russell said, don't you love your family? Don't you love your children? He says, of course. Well, that simple loving consciousness in you, there's God. You don't believe in that? And then he says, well, what is the nature of the God you don't believe in? And the God he doesn't believe in is this sort of ridiculous patriarchal notion of a guy in a white beard up in the sky controlling the universe and created the earth 6,000 years ago. That's what he rejected when he was a teenager, and yet he threw out all of spirituality with it. And he's just now starting to reconnect with it, just starting, and then his wife passed away a couple months after Elizabeth did, and I was having all these amazing numinous experiences, and Elizabeth was pulling off a lot of paranormal phenomena, causing, the lights to go on and off in the house, and all kinds of amazing dreams and communications, very, very far out stuff. And I hadn't even told my father, because I've just learned, just don't stretch his belief system too much. And so finally, but after his wife passed away, I told him about all these communications that have been happening. And it was a complete challenge to his belief system. I said, well, what have you got to lose of just, opening your mind to the possibility that her consciousness may be still existing and may actually be even able to perceive you. It's claimed in a lot of the spiritual teachings that a departed person's consciousness hangs around, and is able to be, 10 times more psychic and clairvoyant, and knows your every thought when they're disencumbered from the body. And I said, just on the offhand chance that that's true, what have you got to lose of trying to send loving thoughts to her, communicate to her. In many of the traditions, the living play a very critical role to helping the people who have gone beyond find their orientation and even realize what happened. Because it's hard to tell that you've died sometimes. You're in a different environment and you can't interact with all your loved ones. It can be very scary. And if you have your loved ones who are hip to what's going on and they're telling you, here's what happened. You died, but it's okay, and actually giving them spiritual instructions on how to orient themselves. That's what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is about. It's actually called the Tibetan Book of the Liberation of Hearing in the Bardo. That was sort of an American marketing ploy to call it the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But I told him all this stuff, and I told him about all the things. Elizabeth has even communicated, she's even been DJing music to me and doing art and all kinds of stuff from the other side that's quite remarkable. And I told him all this. It was just completely blew his mind, but it went in a lot deeper because he had just lost his wife. And a couple days later he called me and he said, I think Brenda's communicating with me, which was his wife. And because I had told him of all the experiences we had with the lights going, Elizabeth had said she would use a signaling thing with the lights, and so the lights in the house would go on and off 3 times, and each time it would do that, we'd all get this incredible sense of her presence and feel that she's communicating with us. And I told this to my father, and 2 days after that, he was awakened up in the middle of the night by the fan, kind of loud fan in his bathroom, near his bedroom, going on. And he got up and he went in there and he turned the switch and it wouldn't go off, and it was on. And he said he started getting chills, and then he just turned and he says, Brenda, is that you? And then after a minute or two, just a short while, it then went off. And he took that as a tentative affirmation that was her way of communicating to him. So that, believe me, was a major shift in his worldview. And that was sort of like the crack in his cosmic egg, and it started, he started becoming much more open-minded. But, 25 years later, I had pretty much given up in it because he was so identified with and dedicated to that worldview, and so anything I would say was just always dismissed. So I kind of got trained to not bring it up. It almost just became comical to me because as a dream character for me, my father was the perfect living symbol of reductionist, spiritless, soulless science. So I got to interact with the old paradigm in person through my father. And I could sort of use him as a baseline to test things, that I... So I think we could take a break. How long? Sure. What is the linear time coordinate? 2 after 5? Yeah. So how long do we have to go?
6:30.
6:30? Okay, great.
Can you do that?
Yeah, I can do that.
This may be for you.
Huh? Oh, thank you. You giving this to me? Okay, great. I'll read it. Thank you. Hi. Okay. Good. So in this last hour, I covered some of the groundwork in talking about light and time, both of which I think are fundamental scientific definitions need great expansion. Time is not linear, and it's primarily a function of consciousness. Light is multidimensional, and there's a lot more to it than just visible light. To take into account the light by which we see, which is sentience itself, and recognize that we literally are in the process of crafting a new science of light on this planet, and that it's a science of light that will be profoundly congruous and supportive of the scriptures of light and the spiritual teachings of light, and that this new science of light will actually support us in the process of spiritual awakening and helping support the global spiritual awakening that's unfolding, because science that's been restricted to 3 dimensions has largely, almost entirely, been used for supporting material progress. In other words, advancing our ability to manipulate matter. That's pretty much what people think science is for. The idea that our findings in science could actually have profound implications for freeing our consciousness is not part of the general program. Whereas I feel that if we just make a few changes in the axiomatic set underlying science, we end up with a science in which all kinds of paradoxes and contradictions are elegantly resolved, and the huge bonus that it's completely congruous and not only just in harmony with, but helping us more deeply understand and engage what all the spiritual wisdom traditions are telling us as well. So that we can actually have a spiritual scientific synthesis that's rigorous, coherent, and can allow us to even engage and make use of the treasures the spiritual traditions are offering us to even greater capacity. Because I believe that there's a lot of things in the spiritual traditions that have not had precise enough language to articulate them clear enough. Because when you read a lot of the spiritual texts, it became very clear to me, it was a huge revelation, that physics, as it's being manifested today, is talking about the laws of three-dimensional light. And the laws of matter is a subset of the laws of three-dimensional light, because E equals mc squared shows how light, basically how light or energy and mass are just interconversions of each other. So science as it had been practiced is describing the laws of the outer light, and the laws of matter as a subset of the laws of 3D light. And the scriptures, as I read them, they're describing the laws of the inner light. And yet they don't have a precise enough mathematical model to come up with a unified description of what they're saying so that they can all agree on it. And they're all largely arguing with each other about whose definition is right or wrong, when in fact they're all speaking about this numinous, luminous, unified beingness in which everything is arising. And there's profound wisdom in the scriptures. And so it became really clear to me that what we need is a physics of the inner light. And that in fact, all the world's spiritual traditions are an attempt to articulate a physics of the inner light without precise enough language. And it struck me very poignantly when I realized that, because having studied a lot of classical physics in school, I realized that when Newton articulated the law of universal gravitation and wrote an equation for it, in that one clear statement of the law of gravitation, which is a simple equation, he was able to unify whole groups of people who had completely divergent views of what gravitation was. In fact, they would have whole debates and meetings, which there would be people who would see gravity as action at a distance, and some of them saw it as a function of this mysterious fluid that was filled space they called phlogiston, and there was all kinds of various theories. And here they were, all together, spending years arguing about gravity. Meanwhile, all of them are being held to the floor by the same force. They're all completely living in the same unified force, all arguing about what it is. And yet when Newton articulated the law of gravitation, all of these different schools could all say, yes, that epitomizes what we're saying. It created profound unification, and suddenly all those schools weren't arguing anymore. If you travel around the world, unless you get into some very esoteric areas, nobody anywhere in the world is arguing about gravitation. The basic law of gravity is the same in Russia, in Tehran, in America. So because of the clear articulation that mathematics provided, created a profound unification. It occurred to me that that's exactly what we're looking for relative to the world's spiritual traditions. The world's spiritual traditions are like the different arguing schools about gravitation, but they're all arguing about love, like what is love or spirit or consciousness, and yet they don't have a precise enough language to articulate it in such a way that they can all say, yes, that epitomizes what we're saying. They can all realize they're all talking about the same thing. And so that's what I've been working on, and have succeeded in offering forth an equation that I think, in a sense, articulates the essence of what the world scriptures is, and it basically describes this profound unified law of consciousness, which is the consciousness by which all of us are shaping our experience of reality moment to moment. So it's the law by which whatever belief system you operate out of becomes true for you to the degree that you operate out of it. And that is a bigger principle. That's a meta-principle that's true for all belief systems. It's the principle by which any belief system you operate out of will appear to be true. And when you can understand that, and when you can see that that's an articulation of the unified field, which I'm just, the whole rest of my talk is really going to be about space, which is what I focused on light and time first, because just showing you how, the consequences of a disabled model of light and time has on the world. Well, one of the most profound disabling consequences right now in our current modern world is our view of space. Space is the vacuum, according to physics, or the quantum vacuum. It's around prior to this century, or prior to the 20th century. We're in another one now. We were viewing space as a substantial medium was common. They viewed it, they saw, there were many different ether models. They saw space filled with some kind of substance. It only stood to reason that if light is traveling through a vacuum, and light is a wave, which they had demonstrated, then there must be something in which, some medium in which the light is waving. And so they called that the ether. And Maxwell himself, his whole model was that he called it the luminiferous ether, which is this substance that space is made of, which light is propagating on. However, around the later part of the 19th century, there was attempts to detect the ether. And there was an experiment done by Michelson and Morley, who set about to detect the ether, but again, they didn't fully check their assumptions. They were setting about detecting the ether, assuming the ether was a static medium. And so if the ether is a static medium, then the planet moving through this static medium, it's like a boat moving through water, they reasoned. And so if you're on a boat and the current is going this way, and you're going into the current, you're going to be going a lot slower if you're going into the current than if you're going with the current or sideways to the current. And so they thought, well, the Earth is like a boat in this ocean of ether. And so it's moving through it. So the speed of light should be slower in some directions than it should be in others. And they set up a very big apparatus between mountaintops, shined light between these 2 points at 90 degrees from each other. Because if you're moving through like water, you're going to go slower in one direction than the other. And they found there was no difference at all. And so that actually was hard to take in. They couldn't detect the ether drift. And so Einstein took that result as the foundation of one of his theories, and he says, there is no ether, yes?
He claimed up and down that he did not know the Michelson-Morley result.
He did not know the Michelson-Morley?
You can imagine, as a youngster, what it'd be like to ride around on the light.
Right. But
But he claimed, for years, till he died, I suppose, he did not know the Michelson-Morley result before coming up with special.
You're right. He did not know, but he said that Einstein didn't build his theory based on that result. He came up with it from a different thought experiments he was doing about imagining riding around on a photon, he didn't even have the photons then, riding around on a light beam. But later, as Einstein's relativity, special and general relativity, got articulated, it got integrated, the Michelson-Morley result got integrated into it, which said, let's just do away with the ether. It doesn't exist. Let's just conceive of space as a pure vacuum, which somehow the fact that light is propagating through it, it's sort of just strange how scientific worldviews catch on at times. It's often not exactly what the originators meant. It sort of catches on and it becomes a kind of collective belief system that then propagates, not necessarily based on evidence. It's very amazing how that happened. And it's also interesting, probably not too many people know, that there was another researcher in the 30s and 40s named Dayton Miller who reproduced all the Michelson-Morley experiments to great precision up in the top of Mount Wilson Observatory. And he got ether drift. He was able to show the ether really is there. And he actually sent papers to Einstein, and he was in communication. And Einstein actually, I have quotes from Einstein saying, if Miller's experiments happen to be true, my whole theory lays in shambles. And they did happen to be true. But then there came about one person who was very dedicated to the new general relativity theory, who just became an attack dog and just totally tried to destroy all Miller's work and wrote these horrible, really negative articles about him, and he was more or less forgotten. But you can find his papers on the internet, and it's just mind-blowing. All this evidence that contravenes the general dogma, that it's showing there really is an ether. But so it goes. What has happened in the worldview in the 20th century is that more or less in science the ether was thrown out, and space for the first time, for a very, very long time, started to be viewed as a pure vacuum, just a pure, dead, insentient nothingness that everything is arising in, and a pure void. And this is a very profound sort of epistemological statement, because if we're arising in sort of pure, dead, empty nothingness, it implicitly has profound implications for our sense of self, because we're embedded in that dead, empty nothingness. So, and our whole sense of the meaning of life and the nature of the universe is based on here's nothingness. I mean, talk about, it's in a sense the most fundamental kind of psychological installation of a worldview of scarcity that you can imagine. Just there's no energy in space. Space is just the void. And so all of science has gone on in this developmental process being obsessed with matter in 3 dimensions. And the focus of attention is on matter, matter, matter. And space is just the place where matter sits. It's just nothing. So there has been very little focus on it. Well, over the course of the 20th century, there's also been this development of quantum mechanics, which was another very challenging new set of results, implying that there's a whole different set of laws at the micro level that totally contravenes classical physics. And in the actual original formulations of quantum physics and the subsequent development of what's called quantum field theory, which is a sort of a more elaborate thing, the problem in quantum field theory and early quantum mechanics is that just assuming space is a vacuum, and quantum field theory is sort of said to be the theory of the interaction between the photon and the electron. It just deals with photons and electrons. But the problem with the theory, which was considered a huge problem, is that the answer to every equation is infinity. And they considered that's a major flaw in the theory, because that's meaningless. In fact, they developed an entire, almost like industry of getting rid of infinity. And it was basically tacked on. It was called the whole renormalization program, bringing everything back to normal, dead, empty nothingness. And that process was fancy mathematical tricks to get rid of infinity, so that you could get a finite answer, because the finite answer was a useful answer then you could go build technology with and manipulate matter with. But the notion that infinity underlied the theory, it seemed to fall on deaf ears that might be trying to say something about reality. And so in quantum field theory they introduced a concept of what they called the zero-point energy, which was, first of all, sort of a theoretical construct. And it wasn't originally called the zero-point energy. It was called the Zwitterbewegung. It was just this sort of ambient kind of of course, electromagnetic, but it was dealt with as just this energy that's somehow in the fabric of space, and that it actually, using the sort of perturbative corrections of this oscillating thing, they could actually get rid of infinity very effectively. And there's actually for quite a long time, there was actually probably 100,000 graduate students all over the world doing nothing but, for their doctorates, ways to get rid of infinity, and to get a real answer. And what was found is that when all motion is a function of temperature, basically. It's thought to be, when you're talking about the atomic realm, motion is jiggliness, basically. There's this kind of random jiggly property to energy and matter, and then the higher the temperature, the greater that is. In fact, that's what temperature is. So they theorize that there's this point, absolute zero, where all thermal motion stops, in which matter becomes static. Well, they brought things down to just a hair's breadth away from absolute zero, and it was still totally jiggling around. And they realized there's some other kind of energy that's jiggling this around. It's not thermal motion. And that's why they called it the zero-point energy, because at absolute zero, at 0 point, it's still jiggling around. And it turns out that that was sort of just hypothesized, but then somebody named Casimir came along and said, if in fact all space is filled with this ambient electromagnetic zero-point energy, and it's the same in all directions, it's isotropic, therefore it would be hard to measure. But because of that, if it's isotropic, that means that in every point of space, you have light coming in from every direction simultaneously at the full spectrum of wavelengths. So you've got the tiniest wavelength all the way to, the huge, long, many, light years long wavelength. So all going through every point. So he reasoned if you put two parallel plates together, that this this isotropic zero-point radiation around the outside of the plates would start creating a pressure, because between the plates, you're chopped off the frequencies that are, or the wavelengths larger than the distance between the plates. And as you move the plates together, you're actually chopping off a greater percentage of the wavelengths larger than the distance between the plates, creating a pressure differential between the zero-point energy outside and the zero-point energy inside. And sure enough, when they did careful experimentations, when you put these two parallel plates together in an absolute vacuum, pumped out all the air and controlled for temperature as much as possible, suddenly these two parallel plates will suddenly just push together. In other words, absolute nothingness did work. It moved matter. And that was a profound empirical demonstration that there really is this energy in nothingness. That empty space is not empty, that it's absolute, it's full of this zero-point energy. And in subsequent work, there was another very important current. There's numerous currents that came together to establish our understanding of the quantum vacuum. It originally wasn't called the quantum vacuum, it was just called the vacuum. But it turned out that when you started applying quantum physics to space and quantum field theory, you had to actually give each wavelength of the zero-point energy basically a half a unit of energy, or a half a quantum of energy. And when you added all that up, the amount of energy that was in a very small amount of space was enormous. And John Archibald Wheeler, who many of you may know about, who was the guy he was a student of, he's at Princeton, and he was the guy who came forth with, he took Einstein's program of general relativity, which in a sense, it's very interesting, we got rid of the ether, and pretty much, and talked about just the space-time continuum. But in a sense, space-time became the new ether, in a way, because the space-time was being warped. How can you warp nothing? So there's a sense when Einstein's talking about the curvature of space-time, there's still this sense like, well, if it's truly an empty void, how can you curve it? And so, in a strange way, space-time became the new ether, but it wasn't really acknowledged as that. And Wheeler, general relativity was a very elegant theory in which you could get rid of the notion of forces, particularly gravitational force, and deal simply with geometry. In other words, rather than actually having action at a distance between a distant object, the presence of mass curves space-time in such a way that rather than being pulled by a distant force, every bit of matter, for the gravitational field is actually the local curvature of space-time. Like, where does a given particle get its moving orders from? It doesn't get it from any distant place. It gets it because it's just free-falling along the geodesic, or the local curvature of space-time. So it, in a sense, got rid of the notion of forces. And gravity is just, everything is free-falling along the curvature of space-time. And Einstein's field equation, which is fairly abstract piece of mathematics that sort of intimidating to a lot of people when they throw it up there. But basically what it says, one side of the equation says space tells matter how to move, and the other side says matter tells space how to curve. And that the two of those together are mutually creating all the pathways of motion in the universe. And it's a very elegant way to look at it. Well, this was being looked at on cosmological levels. John Archibald Wheeler took Einstein's program of general relativity and for the first time applied it to the quantum realm. And he thought, what if mass itself, particles itself, is nothing but points where the curvature of space-time is extremely high? In other words, he was saying, what if matter itself is nothing but pure curved space-time geometry? And he started applying that whole course to the microstructure, and he was deviating far from the orthodoxy, and a lot of people really didn't catch on to what he was doing. He wrote a fantastic book called Geometricodynamics, in which he was trying to look at all reality as just pure dynamic geometry. And it was that book that I found shortly after, while I was at Berkeley, after I'd had my mystical experiences. Another feature of those experiences was an enormous sense of energy. I literally felt like supernovas of ecstatic energy were exploding through me, and the whole universe seemed to me to be a profoundly, intensely energetic display. And I again went to the physicist there and I said, how much energy is in the human body? And this guy says, well, the estimated amount of energy, electricity in the human body is about 12 volts. And I remember thinking, that's not what I'm talking about. I couldn't find anybody anything in science that could reference the kind of levels of intense energy I had directly experienced, like exploding and ecstatically pulsing through me when I had this experience. So when I came across John Wheeler's book, Geometricodynamics, I found something in it that was profoundly important for the work that I was doing. And in there, he articulates, he called the power of the quantum vacuum. He starts talking about the quantum vacuum, and he does a calculation in there saying that the space itself is pure geometry, and it has, at the very microstructure, it becomes very turbulent, that our notion of space and time collapses when you get down to small enough distances. And there's a distance called the Planck length, which is 10 to the negative 33 centimeters, at which the smoothness of space and time, this notion of space as an infinitely differentiable continuum, you could just go smaller and smaller infinitely, that breaks down at the Planck length, and space becomes this turbulent fluctuations that has been called the subquantum foam. It's this dynamic, turbulent geometry. And he did a calculation summing up the total amount of energy. If you add up all the turbulence at the microstructure of space, he said 1 cubic centimeter of space has 10 to the 94th power grams per cubic centimeter in it. And when I read that, I was like, wow, now we're talking. This is like, this perhaps may be what I contacted. I somehow felt that level of energy, and somehow it became immediately accessible to me in these moments of my experience. Anyway, I've spent, the last 20 plus years since I read that really trying to wrap my mind around what that actually means, because that's a very big number. I mean, it's such a big number, it's hard for us to relate to. It might as well be infinity as far as we're concerned, because just to give you some sense of what that means, 10 to the 94th grams per cubic centimeter is 1 with 94 zeros after it, grams per cubic centimeter. So it's a density. It's a statement of an energy density. 1 gram per cubic centimeter is by definition the density of water. So 1 is how dense water is. We're mostly water. So we actually are a little denser than water because we have some more other elements. But I don't know. I don't even know exactly the figure, but I would say we're somewhere between 2 and 5 grams per cubic centimeter. So the density of our bodies is somewhere between 2 and 5. The heaviest materials we know may be 80 or 90 or 100 grams per cubic centimeters, or maybe a little bit more. But here we're talking about a number that actually is so large. When you actually start talking about the number of atoms in the visible universe, that number is just 10 to the 68th power. And here we're talking about grams. A gram can have, almost, hundreds of billions of atoms in it. So we're talking about such a big number that I did all these calculations back then and figured out that, on the one hand, the notion of being able to say how much mass is in the universe is somewhat hubristic, I think, but those kind of figures are out there in astrophysics. And so I figured, okay, I'll just go with the standard mainstream view of how big the universe is, how much mass it has, plug these into the equation, and I figured out that because of E equals, by the way, that number, 10 to the 94th grams per cubic centimeter, notice that it's grams, and we're talking about energy. But because E equals mc squared, E equals m, energy equals mass, and c squared is just a big number. It's about 9 trillion. It's a big conversion constant. What it means, it effectively means that a lot of energy crystallizes, condenses down to a little bit of mass, and vice versa. You can liberate, a little bit of mass can be liberated into a huge amount of energy. So I figured if we estimated all the mass in the visible universe, and then we fissioned it all into energy, in other words, multiplied it by c squared, that figure still is about 10 to the 80th grams per cubic centimeter. So we're still 14 orders of magnitude more than that. So what that's actually saying is that in 1 cubic centimeter, which means each and every cubic centimeter that we're currently being pervaded by, there is more energy than if you took all the matter in the visible universe, fissioned it all into energy or light, and then took all of that and compressed it down to a cubic centimeter and then added 14 more zeros on top of it. It's such an enormous amount of energy. It's completely mind-blowing to contemplate it, and I have found that simply contemplating this is a profound spiritual practice because it fundamentally changes our sense of reality. And so they continue to, however, call this the quantum vacuum. And I said, that everything we know about the quantum vacuum is that it's not empty. It's so full of energy that continuing to call it a vacuum is a misnomer. And so I suggested calling it the quantum plenum, which to me is a much better word because the word plenum means an absolute fullness. It's the exact opposite of a vacuum, and that's what we're dealing with, an exact opposite of a vacuum. In fact, it radically recontextualizes our entire sense of reality. When you start taking seriously that we are pervaded right now by a field with that much energetic intensity, one of the big questions that comes up, though, is why don't we see it? How could that much energy be there and be invisible? Well, it turns out... It turns out that one of the best ways to account for that, and when you read a lot of the quantum field theory books and everything, basically because it's in a state of perfect, omnidirectional, symmetric balance. It's kind of like you could imagine, an enormous amount of force, say like a train with 100 million tons of force going this way. If you have an equal and opposite force this way, and they're perfectly in balance, you're going to notice no net force, even though there's 200 million tons of force in a state of balance. So then if you could conceive of every point of so-called empty space being a place where infinite energy is converging in all directions, every direction, simultaneously, equal and opposite, perfectly canceling itself out, so that rather than seeing space as just nothing, we see it as a very vibrant, dynamic structure of force balancing geometry, such that this infinite energy is omnidirectionally self-canceling and nulling itself out dynamically at every point. That creates such a different frame. And then when you realize that we are actually pervaded by that our body minds are these biocrystalline, tuners that are actually directly tuned to that field. We're not only tuned to it, we are that field. And there's a new view in physics that is still far from the mainstream, but it's very elegant, and it says that, and it's a sort of an evolution from John Wheeler's approach. It says that he called his theory Geometricodynamics, and this view is that all matter is a geometricodynamic modification of the field space of the quantum plenum, which is another way to say that a more intuitive way, perhaps, to think of it is, if you imagine every point in empty space being a place where infinite energies are omnidirectionally canceling themselves out to zero, then what happens if in some direction or some part of that omnidirectional self-canceling, it doesn't perfectly cancel to zero? Imagine there's a slight asymmetry in that omnidirectional self-canceling dynamic. Then you'll end up getting out a little ripple or a little distortion at that point. And what if those little ripples and distortion are mass? So it turns out to be a very elegant way to look at matter itself, to see it as a whole array of different forms of asymmetries of the plenum itself. So from that point of view, it really changes our worldview, because we suddenly see the whole material world, which is thought to be this really dense, solid, real thing, as this infinitesimally tiny modification of a field that is like, almost 100 orders of magnitude greater in its potential than the actual little tiny bit of ripples that are popping out that are the material universe. So from this point of view, all of the material universe is an integrated complex of field asymmetries arising on the surface of the quantum plenum that is this, infinitely energetic field of radiant wholeness. And it's a radiant matrix. And that not only all directions in 3 dimensions does it omnidirectionally cancel, but all directions in multiple dimensions. So one way to look at it is that matter is actually created by an asymmetry in the higher dimensions that actually then manifests as different forms of matter. The asymmetry doesn't even have to happen in 3 dimensions. And in physics, they're sort of onto this in a funny way. Like, I find a lot of physics that leaves out consciousness, it kind of ends up kind of getting to the similar ideas, but in a kind of truncated and distorted way. And in physics now, they have what they call the Higgs field, named after this guy Higgs, who was trying to come up with, well, where does mass come from? And he intuited that it comes from some kind of symmetry break or asymmetry in this field that's now named after him. But the Higgs field is basically the same thing as I'm talking about as the plenum. And that everything that arises, everything that appears, is due to some form of dynamic asymmetry in the plenum. So every form of matter, the whole particle zoo, all of particle physics can be very elegantly recontextualized, seeing every form of particle as just a particular type of geometric asymmetry within the plenum field, a certain way that infinite energy doesn't cancel itself out to zero and persists as an apparently, manifest form for a certain amount of time. There's also lots of situations in which things are in a material form for a while and then they dematerialize. Well, that's a point at which all of a sudden things go back into balance. And what was manifest energy returns back to the unmanifest field of infinite potential. And when there's another asymmetry that's appropriate, you see it precipitate out again. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that the matter that composes this universe is actually in a dynamic process in which it's materializing and dematerializing, millions of times every nanosecond. That this apparent solidity is an illusion caused by the particular way we're perceiving it. And so this sense of that we are living in the plenum, it brings about a worldview that has intrinsic in it, at the deepest level, a sense of infinite open-ended abundance. And that we live in a field that is characterized by boundless luminosity, infinite energy, and this is a stretch for even a lot of the physics community, and it's an infinite intelligence. It's sentient. If you assume intrinsic sentience to the field, it has infinite energy and it's made of light, boundless luminosity, then that is a radically different self-image than a dead, empty void. And it begs the question, when you start talking, again, this is the way the mind tends to work. We're talking about the quantum plenum like it's something else. But when you really think about it, we're talking about our true nature. Those are qualities inherent to us. So rather than just being a dead, insentient nothing, we become imbued with infinite intelligence, boundless luminosity, and infinite energy, which creates a profoundly different sense of self. And it creates a scientific grounding that's based in real results in physics for a new view of human beings that has a completely open-ended human potential. And I think, and another thing that's very profound that I have ended up stumbling into shortly after I discovered Wheeler's book is that it begs the question, if there's that much energy everywhere, why can't we tap into it? You know, why are we burning fossil fuels when, you know, and talking about an energy shortage when in fact there's infinitely more than enough energy for the whole human race for millions of years at every pinpoint of space. And so I set about trying to figure a way to tap the energy out of the space, and I did. And I was very divinely guided, I believe, because my first experiment to test this, I figured if you want to get energy out of this field that has that much energy in it but is in a state of perfect balance, therefore invisible and unmanifest, you just need to create an asymmetry in the field. You've got to tweak space in just the right way and you get energy. In fact, that's how the whole universe is being created. This is all just dynamic modifications of space. And so I took a piezoelectric crystal, just following my intuition. I thought the crystal lattice is a very kind of like a nice symmetric scaffolding, but a piezoelectric the lattice can change when you put a current into it. So I pulsed electromagnetic current into it and adjusted the current and voltage and was tuning the crystal. And at a certain point of tuning, suddenly the crystal went into resonance and it started humming. There was this incredible, beautiful sound. And when I heard that sound, it just rippled through my whole body. I just got chills and all this energy flowed through me. And then I happened to look over at the voltmeter that was measuring the output current. I basically just had a crystal with input current going through it that I could tune. The output current, which was of course less than the input due to resistance in the circuit, at the point the thing was tuned and humming at resonance, there was more than twice the amount of energy coming out than went in. And this was a huge revelation, and it validated my sense that, wow, we can tap into this energy. And I was having this really vast, I was just so excited. I thought, wow, we now have a technology that can make fossil fuel and nuclear power obsolete, unnecessary, and undesirable. This is in 1984. And little did I know that literally within 12 hours, I was arrested. I was arrested and the device was taken from me and I was put in jail and lost my job and went through a whole very Kafkaesque series of initiations into discovering just how committed the dominant paradigm is to maintaining a scarcity-based worldview. And it took me, crazy things happened after that, and I'm not a paranoid kind of person, but all kinds of stuff like that did happen to me that led me to, my house was ransacked, all kinds of weird stuff, and I eventually just figured the human race is psychotic, they're crazy, they're suicidal, they're destroying the planet, and somebody who comes forth with a solution is treated as a criminal. 10 minutes? Okay. And so yeah? No, I didn't publish. I was doing this in my spare time, and after all that happened, I thought maybe it's not such a good idea to publish this. Well, they have killed people, and what it led me to, I ended up just leaving civilization and going out and living in the woods for 6 months just to kind of contemplate what had happened. And the more that was when I was reading all the world scriptures, the more it came into focus what had happened, I just found it profoundly symbolic and archetypally significant that, just doing a little experiment that actually starts to open the floodgates of abundance in a way that could be tangibly utilized and shared with all humanity is totally suppressed in that way. It just shows the challenges we have in helping humanity make the necessary transition from a fundamental core axiomatic set that's fear-based and based in the logic of scarcity and limitation and lack, which necessitates competition and the sense that there have to be the haves and the have-nots. And most of the problems in the world are coming from a basically fear and scarcity-based conviction at the subconscious level. And our challenge as a species is to help move from fear and scarcity to the logic of unconditional love and abundance. And the plenum paradigm gives us a very solid scientific base to affirm that infinite abundance is actually the objective condition of the universe, and that fear and scarcity is a deluded, false assumption that we've all been operating on. And so what I want to conclude with is, in a sense, what I wanted. There's so much more I could say about this. I've spent so much time unpacking the implications of the fact that we live in the quantum plenum, and that we literally are continuous with it. If our bodies are just, maybe 5 grams per cubic centimeter, that's an infinitesimally tiny modification of a field that has 10 to the 94. Actually, that's the 10 to the 94th is the grams figure. If you multiply it by c squared, it's 10 to the 104th ergs of energy per cubic centimeter. And that is not in any way separate from who we are. We are utterly continuous with that field. We're one with it. And one of the main points I'm wanting to put forth at this conference, and I'll present it tomorrow, is the notion that one of the key things of which this whole exploration of subtle energies, and in fact just bioenergetics, the question that's being begged is all the energy that is running the human system just coming from food? The metabolic and caloric model is the reductionist model of where we get our energy. And Jim Oshman I've been talking to him about this for a while, and he says there's major holes in that theory. It doesn't add up. And that there's bioenergetics has this huge gap in it, in which, everybody's told that we understand bioenergetics, but there's a huge gap in it. And I wanted to just go to this PowerPoint presentation that Jim put together, which if you just remove the cap, I think it's, and then, yeah, I'm not sure if you can get it.
There it is. No, it's not. Sorry.
Here we go. So this, by the way, is just one specific application of the profound implications of recontextualizing our existence in terms of the plenum. This question, you ask a normal physiologist or biologist, and they'll say, "Oh, we understand that completely." And let's see, click this. Yeah. A high-energy phosphate bond of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is thought to be the immediate source of all energy for biological processes. That's the model. We have this little guy, baloney. A high-energy phosphate bond is thought to be the immediate source of energy for virtually all biological processes. That's the model. And but very rarely do they actually do very careful quantitative measures to see if it works out. Muscle contraction is a textbook explanation of how ATP provides the energy for contraction. And Jim, who's very good at searching out the literature, said A.V. Hill was a noted British physiologist and biophysicist who received the 1922 Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine for discoveries concerning the production of heat in muscles. In 1950 and 66, he challenged biochemists to account for the source of energy for muscle contraction. He knew the model didn't really account for it. And in a closed reaction system, which we now know that there's no such thing as a closed system, the heat plus the work produced must be equal to the sum of energy, change in the reactants. This is the first law of thermodynamics. 1962, Davies and colleagues showed that ATP really does break down during the contraction of a muscle. And there's the references. This is Jim's, said he heard a lecture at Woods Hole describing in detail that enabled him to determine how much ATP was consumed during a muscle contraction. He had to quick freeze the muscles using this method, and they basically found out that the relation between the heat produced and the phosphorylcreatine split during the contraction of the muscle, there's a bunch of unexplained energy. And his research and others is summarized in the following two articles, and showed that ATP split does not produce enough energy to account for all the heat plus work liberated during the contraction. The difference is referred to as the unexplained energy. Now, the amazing thing is, this work was done in the 70s, showing there's a huge gap in our model. And then Jim did a citation search on these articles. He basically said that liberated cannot be accounted for by the standard model. So there's something going on that's not yet known that must therefore occur to fill in the energetics. He went to the citation index, see if anybody cited those papers. They were not cited, so the problem's been conveniently forgotten.
The Science Symposium had a tremendous paper by Brielle indicating water is being burnt.
Yeah. I think that a lot of the mystery of bioenergetics lies in our deeper understanding of water. Because, given that we're mostly water, I believe that, water plays an important role, but what I'm putting forth is what I like to call a transduction model of light and consciousness that says that we are literally biochemically tuned, are biocoupled into the plenum. We have direct access to that energy, and that's the primary source of the energetics of the phenomena of life. Empty space contains the structure and energy, and the structure is very profound. And I believe that what we see in the structure of space, when we look at it, is the third-dimensional imprint of the geometry of hyperspace. The geometry of the higher dimensions, it's the signature of the spiritual worlds on the surface of three-dimensional space. And here's that reference of 1 cubic centimeter. It says it's greater than the total amount of energy of all the matter in the known universe. That was David Bohm. And that fact is actually not really contested in physics, and yet somehow they sort of seem to disassociate from that. I think it has enormous implications, this quantum plenum model. Then this is the point, that energy from this empty space, which is not empty, the quantum plenum, may provide the missing energy from muscle contraction, and a lot more. I think that the key here is to really develop, and I'm working on it, and I want to really inspire and encourage all of us to sort of become part of the quest to develop what I would generally call a transduction model, that literally all matter, in a sense, doesn't exist in isolation from the quantum plenum, but is in fact has a coupling to it, and that there's an inductive biocoupling to the plenum. And I believe that all matter is because if in fact matter is simply a dynamic modification, an asymmetry in this field of infinite potential energy, then talking about matter and space doesn't really make any sense. They're not different. One is just a dynamically modified version of this fundamental medium, which is being itself. All being is this, and it tends to manifest in this, or exists in this field of unmanifest potential, and yet, the geometry of it creates perturbations that then precipitate out as all the multiple universes of manifest form. And so I think that it also, this view of the quantum plenum sheds enormous insight into the mystery of life, because one of the big unanswered questions that's also sort of conveniently ignored is, what is this apparent difference between organic and inorganic matter? There's a whole bunch of atoms that are just considered inorganic, like sort of dead matter, and then hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon, and a few others
get involved in life, and they're called organic chemistry. And yet, if you separate them out and just look at them independently, there's really no difference between the inorganic and these atoms. But there's something about when they all get together and they start bonding together. I think it makes a lot of sense to say that there's something about the geometry of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen when they bond together. The bond angle geometries create unique molecular patterns that I believe has a unique resonance or biocoupling into the quantum plenum that creates an inductive coupling such that there's an actual flux induced from the unmanifest energy that flows around these types of organic molecules and actually creates a flux field, a self-organizing field that is the life force. And that this whole mystery of chi and prana and the life force and orgone energy and all this stuff that science has such a difficult time with can most elegantly be looked at, yes? That's a good question. I think that I'm not saying that there's no coupling to inorganic matter, but I think that there's a different kind of more intense coupling to organic matter, and it creates a self-organizing field that that starts creating a flux field around it that causes other atoms to be assimilated in and causes the self-organizing process of life to evolve against entropy into more sophisticated life forms all the way up the evolutionary chain. And that's not happening with inorganic matter, so-called, but inorganic matter is also has a connection to the plenum, but it doesn't, in a sense, it may be the signal. If you were to look at it like an antenna, and I think it's useful to look at all manifest matter as somewhat like an antenna in terms of how much it actually, what's the degree to which it's receiving or resonating with this underlying field of infinite potential. The way I look at it is inorganic matter is more resonant with electromagnetism or third-dimensional light, whereas organic matter has a geometry such that it can actually resonate with higher dimensional light, the inner light, and that the interaction between higher dimensional light and organic matter is what gives it this unique animation, which we experience as the life force or prana and chi. And in my own researches in working towards developing free energy technology, which is an ongoing focus of mine, it's very interesting when you develop these certain devices that actually put out more energy than you put in. These are being developed with inorganic matter, and yet in certain resonant configurations you can create what's literally an inductive coupling to the quantum plenum, and some of that energy is actually being drawn into this circuit, and you can use it as extra electricity. I think it's really interesting to note that right there, the energy that comes out of these free energy devices is electricity. And there's this big mystery about, well, how is the life force different than electricity? Because all of the tendency in the scientific community is wanting to reduce the life force to electricity. And there is electricity in the body, but the life force is something else. That's what subtle energy is. And that's this whole conference, in a way, is here because we're trying to deal with this unresolved issue about what's the difference between electricity or electromagnetism and all these things we're just classifying as subtle energies. And I would say that these subtle energies are actually what you get when you have organic systems resonating with higher dimensional light. It actually creates this field of flux, an inductive field around them that has a self-organizing intelligence to it and that manifests as the life force. But if you take inorganic matter and you configure it around and you try to have it interact with the higher dimensional light, you can get it to do it, but it comes out as electricity. And that it's something about the nature of biological atomic assemblages that resonates with the higher dimensional light, which is consciousness, resonates with it in such a way so that the third dimensional manifestation of it is the biofield. And I think that's a very elegant way to look towards a real clear and rigorous resolution of this problem, which is so fraught with confusion and, in talking to a lot of my more straight physicist colleagues, telling them I'm coming to this conference, there's a pervasive notion that this is a bunch of kooky people who are very non-rigorous here. And I hope to, sound a tone that we can be just as rigorous as they can and encompass subtle energies in a very beautiful model that doesn't do any violence to our human potential and doesn't actually negate any of the magic in the universe. And I just sort of, in a way, want to invoke that. And also, finally, to say that the plenum is, since it's something that's pervading us right now, since it's actually the very context and condition in which we're arising, in any moment, if you just simply still the mind, you can actually feel it. The plenum is not just some abstract theoretical thing. It becomes feelingly accessible to a sensitized organism. And the more you become sensitized, the more you integrate, you get the stress out of your system, the more you integrate and unfold all the higher potentials of our nervous system, we become greater and greater or more coherently biocoupled to the plenum and become literally able to live out of that context of unconditional being, which is literally living in the context of unconditional love, infinite abundance, boundless luminosity, infinite intelligence. Another manifestation of the scarcity paradigm, which is the notion of intelligence. The idea that you take an intelligence test and that's how intelligent you are. That's a scarcity-based model of intelligence. Are we out of time?
We are. You only have about 15 minutes for supper before
15 minutes? Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm really happy to be able to share this with you, and thank you. I want to ask for your help in the big challenge ahead of bringing forth a plenum-based, abundance-based, love-based paradigm, because I feel that this gives us a very solid scientific basis for articulating what I call a love-based, spirit-based science of abundance.
Are you writing a book?
Yeah, I am. I'm writing a book, and I'm working on a much more kind of rigorous and mathematical version of this that I may be able to present here next year. But I just wanted to invoke the plenum, and then, once you understand this, when you read the scriptures, all of these references to the divine being, being omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, infinite energy, infinite intelligence. Then you go to the people working in quantum field theory, and you look at the qualities they're identifying with what they still call the quantum vacuum. They're the same words. We're clearly talking about the same reality, and it coming from these very different frameworks. And I think the need to see that what the mystics and people who are very spiritually attuned and the scientists exploring the leading edge of the quantum vacuum, converging on the same reality. And it's very good news, because it provides a radical solution to not only our material problems by potentially providing a clean energy technology that doesn't require us to throw the biosphere out of balance at all and can make all these destructive technologies obsolete, but it also provides a solution to the spiritual problem, the spiritual malady afflicting humanity, because really all our problems really come down to a spiritual problem. What's going on the planet? We have a major spiritual crisis, and it needs a spiritual solution. Trying to fix it with technology is just a stopgap measure. In fact, because this consciousness is not evolved to be able to embrace and live out of a sense of boundless abundance, it's dangerous to try to bring forth free energy technologies into such a fear-ridden, scarcity-based, competitive-based species. So I really feel that it's very important to understand that what the spiritual teachers throughout the ages have been pointing to us in talking about this higher potential this possibility of living a life more abundantly and more consciously, they're pointing to that we already are the technology. We are already the free energy technology, and that we're already tapped into this field of boundless luminosity, and that we have the potential to become, in free energy technology, an over-unity device is the term given to a device in which you get more energy out than you put in. And I believe that what the great spiritual teachers have been pointing to is the fact that we have the potential to become over-unity humans. And that a lot of the great saints and mystics and people who have incarnated love to profound degrees are demonstrating that they are really ultimately living on the plenum. And there's more and more breatharians, people who aren't even eating or drinking, who are demonstrating that. And that you can't account for that with that old model. And so, to me, this seems like a really good offering of an alternative scientific framework that is completely embraces and even enhances our understanding of spiritual reality. Absolutely. Well, it was great. Jim understood it immediately, and the importance of it too. And he said, "That's the explanation, for the missing energy."
What about Peter Russell?
Peter Russell's a great friend of mine.
He's always found the same thing with consciousness and life.
Yeah. He's basically onto the same thing. In fact, you find a lot of people are really onto the same reality, and in different ways. It's.
How about?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Howdy. I have my sense of working with it is it's hard to do that because the infinite energy is converging all over the place, trying to bring everything back into balance. So my sense of a lot of these free energy devices is that they work by creating a temporary imbalance, and then it's immediately thrown back into a balance. So you have to, in a sense, create repetitive temporary imbalances. And the problem in a lot of this research is it's very difficult to end up getting just huge amounts of energy. In some cases, you can do that, but most of the initial work, it's like we're just sipping the very tiniest bit of energy out of the plenum, and it tends to be quite benign in the way it manifests. However, yeah, you could do that, and I do know of one particular inventor who has developed a device, and his problem is there's so much energy coming through it, he's got to constantly tone it down. But in general, I think the universe is doing a very good job of keeping itself in balance.
Do an efficiency equation or calculation, it would be awfully inefficient just to extracting the energy that we need.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Would it be any different, or is it the same?
Yeah, I'm done with it. I'm done. This is, I think, Carl's, yeah.
To use fields to separate vacuum fluctuations so they don't annihilate each other too quickly. And
then you
take advantage of the voltage and also your ability to predict where they're going to annihilate each other. So even though you have to put in energy into separating them, you're also going to be able to use the light that's created when they annihilate.
There's a lot of inventors. It's a very interesting realm going around visiting all these free energy inventors because almost all of them have paid a huge price to pursue their sort of non-traditional course, and a lot of them have been traumatized, and they don't have a traditional model, and so they've got all these completely models they created themselves of reality. But one of the common features I've seen people demonstrate working devices that really put out a huge load with a small input, and there's one guy I know in particular. He says that's exactly what his device is doing. He says it's basically separating the electrons and the positrons. And normally there's pair production going on in the vacuum all the time. Right. Positrons, electrons emerging and annihilating each other right away. And he says he creates a field in which he separates those, and then is able to process the positrons in one way, and then uses the electrons as just electricity.
Right.
And I mean that's a common feature of the real common feature is some form of asymmetry.
So it could be that in a sense we're not stealing any energy from the plenum. We may just borrow it a little longer than it's usually borrowed.
Well, it's an interesting notion. I mean, that's one way of talking about it. But in a way, the matter. I mean, when we say we are maybe stealing or borrowing energy of the plenum, we're speaking from an identity that's not the plenum. We are the plenum.
Sure.
And so, who are we stealing it from? How can you steal it from?
But it's not clear whether it's my portion of the plenum or yours. But once it's inside us, it's ours. Otherwise, it's God's.
One of the things I think is most exciting about this paradigm is that the plenum provides a new universal basis for a human identity that takes us beyond the sort of primary, the encapsulated separate self that discrete encapsulated separate self.
It makes the Atman Brahman.
Yeah.
But there's still a distinction between the way it operates in one person or another, and we have to honor those wonderful differences. So it could be that we're involved in a borrowing trick,
right?
To the extent we consider the plenum divine and different from us. But of course, we're doing nothing but being who we are if we're connected in the right way and can take advantage of it.
Right.
But how do you distinguish between creating a little imbalance in the plenum and simply utilizing the vacuum fluctuations that have already popped out of it and just haven't dived back yet?
Well, generally they pop out for such a short time. I mean, there's this relation called the time-energy uncertainty principle.
Right.
Are you familiar with that? And that sort of provides sort of the limiting case on which you can borrow energy.
Okay.
The more energy that comes out, the shorter time you have to.
Right. So how would you create an imbalance that creates a more permanent availability?
Well, I don't think it's in a sense permanent. You have to actually create a resonant condition in which the short time in which it's available is reproduced in such a way so that there's a stable net energy coming out, but you're still not violating the time-energy uncertainty principle.
Okay, so that may be similar to the kind of resonance I was thinking of, where you entrain the vacuum fluctuations so they're coming out more predictably or cyclically.
Just as an example, I know of a particular device that I've studied extensively, and these sort of technologies are such a threat to the existing power structure, but they do exist, they do work, and it's just a matter of time until they find their way into larger use. And one of them I know of is basically it has no moving parts. It's basically two inductive coils with toroidal fields, and it's all a matter of tuning. You basically, a lot of people have tried to reproduce it and they go, it doesn't work. It's because the tuning is everything. You get it tuned properly, and you can tune it in such a way that you get increasing amounts of energy out, anywhere from about 20 times over unity to 50. 50 is fairly easy to produce, but you can get into many hundreds and thousands at a stable level. Now, that doesn't seem to fit with our notion of the time-energy uncertainty principle, that how could we get that energy out?
Can you use it indefinitely, or does it cycle back?
No, you can just use it. It just becomes a power source. You could hook it up to your house, unplug the utility wires, and just power your house on it.
Now, do you think the resonance, the way you're tuning it, captures the vacuum fluctuations that are there momentarily in a more periodic way?
That's one model. I mean, I have to say that really we don't understand fully how we're doing it. We do know that we're getting a load out that can light your light bulb. But the question is, there's still a lot of more work to be done in the theory area.